to, cool. Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody to the second of the CogSci 2023 Abstraction Workshop virtual flip sessions. So if you've rolled up to this meeting today, you probably found us through our website or through you've seen the links from one of our organizers. But in case you don't know, this is part of a 4-part series for a workshop that's going to be culminating in an in-person workshop that will be hosted both virtually but also live on site at CogSci 2023, which is going to be held in Sydney later this month. And so the way that the workshop is happening today, this is the second of the 2 seminars. Our first one was on causality. Today we'll be focusing on perception and action. And I'm so excited to be hosting this, I should mention, by the way, with my fellow co-organizers, Wai Keen Vong, Marcelo, and Judy, who are all here today as well. So the theme of this workshop, of course, most broadly, is to think about what we're looking for views that will help us think in a unified manner about how the human mind discovers useful abstractions. And we're looking for that to be unifying, not only across different domains of cognition, but also across different kinds of computational levels. And I think you'll hear from our speakers today at all of those, both cashing out at the neurological level and all the way up to, some overarching computational theories. However, I think especially because so much computational and also empirical work in abstraction has been highly domain specific, we've actually designed this workshop to take place over 4 virtual domain specific seminars. As I mentioned, the first one of these was focusing on theories that have been focused on causal abstraction. Today will be the second one focused on theories of perception action, abstraction, perception, action. Moving ahead, we'll actually have 2 workshops on the same day, one on language. We have another really great group there, and then finally concluding with memory. And then at the workshop, we'll be bringing all of our speakers back together to think together about unifying themes and trends that cut across all the different theories that we'll hear from and work that we'll hear from today. So just to give a rundown of what today is going to look like, for the first 30 minutes, we've asked all of our speakers to give very informal opening statements. Each of these is going to last for 5 minutes, so we'll ask you guys to please keep it brief, especially so that we can open up the floor for 2 minutes immediately afterwards for any questions that are just immediate clarifying questions. So if you have any kind of overarching question, we'll ask you to hold that to the general panel discussion. Then after everyone has made their opening statements and we've kind of gotten the lay of the land, we'll open up for a broad general panel discussion, which I'll be moderating. But please feel free at that point to type your questions into the chat and we'll ask them to all of our panels. And we'll probably also, since I don't think there's too many people here, we can also have people just raise their hands and let you guys speak as well. I'm so excited to just quickly introduce who we have with here today. I think we have really the best group we could think of to be speaking on this theme. So we'll open things up with Hongjing Lu. Hongjing is professor in psychology and statistics at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she heads the Computational Vision and Learning Lab. And her research investigates how people manage to draw what seems like an incredible thing, inferences from extremely sparse and often ambiguous and noisy data, as well as starting to look into how intelligent machines might do the same. And much of her work focuses on motion perception, action recognition, and causal learning. Next, continuing our theme of perception, we'll hear from Dan Baer, who has worked in many groups over the years, but most recently has done postdoctoral work with Dan Yeamans as a research fellow in psychology at Stanford. And over the years, he's marshaled a really rich body of work studying how it is that animals create internal models of the world, how they come to learn about their environments from sensory experience, and then how this knowledge is ultimately actually represented in the brain. From there, we'll move bridging between perception and action. Kelsey Allen is currently a senior research scientist at DeepMind, and she studies the computational principles underlying how people learn and use efficient, generalizable representations for physical problem solving, with a special focus on how people represent rich physical simulations and represent tool use. Finally, last but definitely not least, we'll kick off, or we'll close off our opening statements with Mark Ho. Mark is a faculty fellow currently at the NYU Center for Data Science, and he studies how people solve problems, both individually and interactively, by developing rich computational models of planning and social cognition. In all of our opening statements today, we've asked our speakers to answer two questions, or to seek to lay the ground to answer two questions. First, broadly, what concrete phenomena does a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? And then more specifically, what is it that characterizes useful abstractions in the domains of both perception and action? So with that, Hongjing, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. Let me see, and then I can share the screen here. Can people see it? See my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks Leo and Marcelo and Wai Keen, Judy, and for organizing this wonderful workshop. So the first speaker, I think I can start from one extra slide and the debate between two philosophers here. You see here, moving. And then I like, and then this is a debate between two philosophers, and John Locke, and basically, and then I mentioned he has a famous quotation said, "There's nothing in the mind that was not previously and in the senses." So the basic idea is mind and was the blank slate, and the knowledge is determined primarily by experience and driven from sense, perception, and action. And Godfrey and hold views. And then he basically paraphrasing this sentence said, and there's nothing in the mind that was not previously in the senses except the mind itself. So the point is that the mind is not a passive slate upon which an experience writes. And instead, the mind is a complex thing and that works on and transforms experience. So in my view, and part of the answer about how the mind transforms experience and lays on abstraction, the core idea of this workshop. And then back to the two big questions, there's some of my thoughts about the concrete phenomenon that a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain. And then the number one, I think, is that actually things we do every day, all the time, is out of the distribution generalization. This is what we see, and then from our eyes, and we see in all this rich world, and with all these interesting colors and shapes and so on. But over decades, and the vision scientists, what they test is out of a distribution and a generalization stimuli. And then we can create shapes and from unusual materials. And then there's a line joints, we still can recognize it. And we still can recognize the dog and the hidden Dalmatian dog and from these fragmented materials. So not only static image and the dynamic situation, the same thing. And this is what we observe and then in real life. And then this is what we test and in the laboratory and in this kind of abstract form. And from this dozens of dots, and we can perceive actions, and then we can perceive more. And then even with the geometric shapes like this hider and the symbol stimuli, and then we can perceive the social goals and roles, and from this simple movements. So this types of out of the distribution generalization, I think it's a prime example about abstraction. But abstraction does not only makes us to see the whole and to recognize the object, it also can make us still and recognize the parts and then the relationship between the parts. So basically, I think here, not only you see the forest, you also can see the trees. So here is like some of the interesting work, and then a shout out from Taylor Webb's work and from our lab. And then now in this case, you have the different cat and then with different object, cat, horses, and not only you recognize them, you also can find the correspondence and between the correct parts and the relations between the parts. If you have this knowledge, and then you can do the far analogy and to connect the different objects from different domains and birds to airplane and line joins and then to real images. So I think this out of the distribution generalization need to be at both the whole level and the part level. Then the second, the types of concrete phenomena I was thinking is the generation. So people can generate and beyond the visible things. And so I think Kelsey and we'll talk more about these types of the work in intuitive physics. And then you can tell people if I put the water into it or I put the ball into it, what's the trajectory? They will come out and from these two. And then the other types of the creative generation types of tasks. And then I like the example from Deirdre Gardner. You can ask a preschooler if a tree had a knee, where would that be? This is the novel problem. You can put the trees in different orientation, and the preschoolers and can put this imaginary knee and in a reasonable spot here. So the third and the concrete phenomenon I think is important is that the human visual system is not only recognize entities, objects, we also recognize relations and the relations and between these entities. So I think this is still what the machine system, the intelligent system is short of. So here I give two examples. These are the tests from DALL-E and the text generate and the visual machine systems. And you can give a text prompt, and then you can let it generate the images. So this is the work. This is a work from Conwell and Ullman. And then so you can generate the spoon and in a cup, very nice and generated images. But now if we create and then the novel situation, by changing the relation, but keeping the same entities, lets the system to generate a cup on a spoon, and then you can see this total failure. And because in real life, and we don't see, and then so common, and with these types of own relationship between these two entities, the system and does not show ability to generate these types of images. So here is another example. You can show a woman and chases a boy, and the boy chases a dog. Each of these entities are correctly generated, but the relations are messed up. So I think and then the abstraction, another concrete phenomena is the theory and should be able to explain and then the visual relations between the entities and so on. For the second question is that what counts for useful abstraction? And in one my sentence would be like a conformal and latent and representations that are useful for downstream tasks in memory and reasoning. I think there are a few and characteristics important to keep in mind. One is that these types of abstract representations should be in a low dimensional space. So that will be for efficient coding, encoding in memory, and then communication language and inference in reasoning. And meanwhile, and then in this type of abstract space, and we still have disentangled features. So this will help and for rapid discrimination. And so finally, these types of the abstract representations, well, what really help the formation of categories. And all these categories and will be naturally consistent with causal structures in the world. So finally, and these types of abstract representations, and then provide a way and to be easily formed a structured representation, so that we can move from non-structured input and sub-symbolic input and move toward more symbolic representation. So that's some of my thoughts into these two questions.
Great, thank you so much, Hongjing. Does anybody have any immediate burning questions? Otherwise, we'll move right on to Dan Baer. And just as a reminder, we are constantly monitoring the chat, so if you do have questions, feel free to put them in. Okay, I think it was just incredibly clear. I'm very much looking forward to digging into that. Dan, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. Can people see this okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay, yeah, I'm Dan Baer. I work at Stanford with Dan Yeamans, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. So yeah, I got the same prompt. What concrete phenomena does a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? And so for the sake of the next few minutes, I'm going to define abstraction here to mean anything invoked by a theory or a mental model of the world. I don't know if this is a universal definition of abstraction, but I'm happy to defend it. So that's what I'm going to mean by it. And my answer is a theory of abstraction, of some particular abstraction, needs to explain three key things. First, what problem is that abstraction or the model that invokes it an attempt to solve? So this is sort of like, I don't know, I'm a biologist, so maybe this is like a bit of an evolutionary perspective of, what's the reason that there's a particular abstraction or model there? Then second, where do the candidate abstractions for that problem come from? So where do the possibilities for even how to solve it come from? And finally, how are the good ones selected and the bad ones discarded? So, if you wanted to think of this in terms of concrete phenomena, this is really questions about how does one come up with a good internal model of the world in order to solve some, consequential problem. Now, I have to say that this question in general about how we come up with good models may be, in a sense, like AGI complete, in the sense that any very general answer of how do we come up with good theories or models or solve problems in general is equivalent to, the question of how does one build an AGI. So obviously, I have no idea, and I'm not going to try to answer that today. So just for the next few minutes, I'll talk about my personal attempt to answer these three questions on one very particular perceptual abstraction. And the one I'm going to use here is something that we call a Spelke object. So a Spelke object, by which I mean, is a collection of physical stuff that can be moved or expected to move as a cohesive body, independent of other stuff in a scene. And so, under that definition, many, although not all, everyday objects are Spelke objects. So things like cars, cups, plates, toys, and so on are Spelke objects. Something like a house is probably not a Spelke object because, it doesn't really move independently of everything else. And as probably many of you can tell, the name Spelke object is alluding to the seminal work of Liz Spelke and her colleagues, who found that this particular perceptual abstraction has a stereotyped developmental trajectory, in that in young babies, so less than 4 months old or so, babies perceive elements of scenes visually and also through other modalities as belonging to coherent, movable objects, if and only if they're moving coherently together. So even if there are other features like occlusions or textural differences and so forth that might, otherwise suggest that they're different objects, if two parts of a scene are moving together, young babies perceive them as single objects. However, as they get older, and certainly by the time they're around a year old, babies have learned to perceive things as coherent objects, even if they're not moving together. So a year-old baby can look at a scene of a bunch of stuff lying around, like their toys, and knows basically what the independent objects are and how they can be moved. So in this particular case of Spelke object abstraction, I'm going to suggest that those developmental experiments or data are enough to suggest a pretty concrete set of answers to these three questions. So what is that abstraction trying to solve? Where do the candidates come from? And how are the good ones selected and the bad ones discarded? Okay, so here are my answers. My answers are that this abstraction of Spelke object comes from trying to predict how the physical world changes and how it can be changed. The candidates come from perhaps innate or at least very early developing mechanisms for querying or grouping elements of a scene into higher level entities, and I'll say more about that in a sec. And then the good ones are the ones that are actually useful for making predictions about how scenes can change, especially when acted on. And I say these are sort of concrete enough answers that one can actually try to build a computational model that instantiates them. And so if you have the opportunity to do that, you always should, and see whether it works. So I'll just very briefly tell you about a computational model in which the Spelke object abstraction naturally emerges because it's useful. And hopefully that will also answer sort of the second prompt question for this panel. So this model has two key ingredients. One is a world model that's optimized to make predictions about visual dynamics, so video data. And the technical details of this are extremely important, but I won't go into them right now. Just to say, this is a model that gets some piece of visual data, like part of a video, and has to fill in the rest. So it might get a frame of video and then little pieces of other parts of the video and have to fill in that remaining piece. So that's ingredient one, you have a predictive model. And then ingredient two is using that model to make counterfactual predictions about scenes. So what I mean by that is, I can show you by example. So take this image of my colleague's kitchen. There's a banana bowl, and I'm going to ask this model, what would happen if those two green points on the banana were moving and the two red points were static? So I'm not asking literally in language, I'm prompting the model basically by clicking on those points. And now if it's a good model, it basically is forced to make a particular answer, which is if those two green points were moving, the entire banana would be moving. Because a good predictive model of the world will know that, bananas have to move as cohesive wholes. They can't, move in little bits and pieces. So if those 2 points were moving, the entire banana would be moving. And so if you look at a map of motion or optical flow for, the model's simulation of what would happen, you can see that it isolates that single thing as an object. And so putting this together, my hypothesis here is that the Spelke object abstraction is really, predictive models guess of which parts of a scene would be moving conditional on some parts moving. Or in other words, like if I say, okay, what would happen if this one point in a scene were moving, what else would be moving? And that's enough to give you the abstraction of a Spelke object. And so here are just a couple of examples of that from, the scene with a robot taking stuff out of a bin. So if I ask that about, a point on the robot arm, that gives the object that's the robot arm. If I ask it about this other weird thing, it's that. If I ask it about this envelope, it's that, and so forth. And so just the final thing I'll say is, I think that this is like a very particular concrete case of how an abstraction can arise. But my colleagues and I think that it could be much more general than that. And, maybe many, if not all, perceptual abstractions could be explained as emerging from this combination of having a predictive model of the world. So the problem is trying to make predictions, and then querying it as a way of trying to make decisions about how to act. So, happy to go into that further or talk about that any other time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dan. We'll open that up for a couple of questions after this one.
Sure.
Okay, Dan, I actually do have a question, a clarifying question, but feel free to punt on this if it's too broad.
Sure.
Because you gave this nested definition and a very general one of abstraction as anything invoked by a theory or mental model of the world. Maybe two clarifying questions. Do you see that as, I think, sounds like you do, but do you see that as general beyond perceptual abstraction and kind of a general definition of abstractions? That's question one. And question two, can you give a brief definition of what you mean broadly by theory or mental model of the world?
Sure. Yeah, I'll do my best. I do think it is more general beyond that. And it might take a little while to go into why, but yeah, I think that I guess I would define an abstraction as something that plays a key role in a particular model or a particular theory. And it can't be any theory. It has to be a good one, and it has to be good in the sense that, like, if you were to try to vary it or alter it by making that abstraction different, it would ruin the theory. So I actually I had an example of this, of what makes cats and dogs a good abstraction. But I took it out because I didn't want to talk for too long, but I could go into that later. But yeah, my general definition here is, an abstraction is just an element of a theory, but it has to be one that's essential to that theory. So, if you changed it, it would kind of ruin it. And sorry, you had a second question, but I forgot it.
The second question was just a brief definition of your brief working definition of theory or mental model.
Okay, yeah, a definition of mental model. Well, I guess theory and mental model, I basically mean the same thing, which is, you know, an attempt to like explain something about the world that, you know, an animal or an agent is situated in, that is an attempt to solve some problem. So, you know, this one that I'm talking about would be a model that's attempting to solve the problem of, you know, predicting what's going to happen as a consequence of one's actions.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll turn it over to Kelsey. Thank you, Dan.
Can people see my screen? Can anyone give me a verbal yes, because I cannot actually see participants while I'm sharing the screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, excellent. All right. So thank you very much for having me. I'm Kelsey. I'm currently a research scientist at DeepMind, although next year I'll be an assistant professor at UBC and the Vector Institute in Canada. And I generally study the problem of physical problem solving and as it relates to both tool use and tool creation. And I think these are essentially epitomes of what abstraction research should really be able to explain. So that's going to be my goal to talk to you about today. I'm not going to present any theories, nor any definitions, nor almost anything actually about my own work, just a little tiny bit. But instead, I'm going to try to convince you why we should think about functional objects as being sort of the optimal combination of perception and action for thinking about abstraction more generally. So first, I just want to try to illustrate that with a couple of points here for why tool use and tool creation are really interesting things to study, especially from the perspective of abstraction. So if you think about these very simple tools that were, you know, made hundreds of, I guess, tens to hundreds of thousands of years ago, they all resemble different kinds of capabilities that people had but couldn't actually use. For example, like if you think about what a knife is, it's essentially a tooth that has a sharp edge that you can control with your hand, right? You had to abstract the functional property that you would want about perhaps your mouth to something that you would be able to control, like with your hand, and that allowed you to create something like a stone knife for the first time. Or imagine making a stone hammer, right? You might be able to smash things reasonably well with your fist, but you understand something about the physics of the world such that if you could imagine having a much more massive fist, then it's likely to do more damage to the thing you're trying to smash. This is another example that I particularly like, just to demonstrate that this kind of tool-based abstraction happens at very young ages. So it's not about the semantics of this shovel, right? This young boy is instead trying to use this shovel for a pretty novel purpose of getting this tasty out-of-reach Easter egg. And that's because he was able to abstract the important functional properties of that object in the ways that he could act on them, namely that that shovel is long enough to be successful in order to give it a try. Now, abstractions are not always helpful, right? Despite the fact that he was able to make that abstraction, it didn't actually allow him to achieve his task, but it did constrain the kinds of ways that he tried to. And across many, many generations, we've applied these same processes of abstraction, not just to use tools, but also to create extremely fancy modern tools, like this example of an artificial lung, which biomedical engineers created by understanding the important input, output, and causal mechanisms of actual biological human lungs in order to replicate it so that they could implant it in a patient and allow that person to breathe. So what do I actually think in terms of, you know, the benefits, or what should, what characterizes a useful abstraction? And then also, what are the cognitive phenomena that are associated with that? The very first one that I want to talk about is something that was also alluded to in the first talk around out of distribution generalization, but out of distribution generalization in the context of action. And to motivate that, I want to show you this example of a catapult. Now, this was a catapult that might have existed in medieval times, right? And it could be used to hurl a super large rock, maybe potentially covered in flaming oil, at your enemy's castle. But more recently, catapults could also be used as a sort of fun summertime activity of launching a person into a lake. Or in even more modern times, for better or for worse, we could make a catapult out of just everyday household materials like a crumpled piece of paper and spatula and toilet paper roll here. Now, what makes all of these things a catapult are the relational abstractions in terms of how the different elements relate to one another, right? In all cases, there's something to be launched, there's a lever arm of some kind, and some way of applying force to the end of that lever arm. And by learning this abstracted relational notion of a catapult, you might be able to reuse that concept in a novel situation without having to plan all from scratch again. Now, the cognitive phenomena that this then entails is not just appropriate reuse of these kinds of action abstractions, but also inappropriate reuse. And I'm going to show you one example of each. So in the first case of appropriate reuse, there's a very nice set of studies done by Brown in 1990 with colleagues, where they were looking at 2 to 3-year-old children, and they were asking them to do a fairly simple problem of get some out of reach toy using one of these 5 available objects. Now, kids under 2 years of age could not learn to do this themselves, but they would have a parent show them how, and then they would be able to do it with the particular object again a couple more times. Now, after children succeeded, either on their own or with the help of a parent 3 times, they were then shown this new set of tools, where one is going to be functionally practical, which is this hook, but all of these other objects, despite having relevant properties, like, for example, this rod being very long, this weird sort of fuzzy stick also being very long, since those did not have a hook, the children would not be able to reach the far away object and would not be successful here. However, they did choose this hook object and they ignored perceptual features that might be more similar to the thing that they used in training. So for example, in many of these cases, the children were using a rake in the training session, but then they transferred to the hook in the testing session, even if they couldn't use the rake themselves on their initial attempt. This suggests that they're abstracting the important functional properties of these objects and learning how to reuse that plan in a new context for the first time. Now I just want to show you one quick example of inappropriate transfer. So for this, I'm going to show you a very small amount of data from a study that we ran in this game that we call the virtual tools game. And in this game, this is a level called catapulting. You get to select one of the 3 tool-like objects on the right-hand side of the screen and then drop it somewhere in the scene. And as soon as you do so, you get the physics is going to be turned on and you get to see the outcome of what happened. The goal is always to get that red ball into the green area. So you can see that in this particular case, you have to catapult the ball into the goal using the large block in order to be successful. So in this experiment, we had people train on many different levels that look sort of like this catapulting situation. And then we asked them to solve a test level. And this is what we saw. So in this test level, you can see again, we have a catapult here and 3 different available tools. And everyone who is trained on this catapult level does actually catapult the ball into the goal. And people who are untrained do a sort of interesting mixture of either catapulting the ball into the goal or just trying to hit the ball directly into the goal. Each of these different colored points is representing an individual participant, with the position being where they put the tool and the color representing the identity of the tool that they chose. Now, this looks like people have indeed correctly abstracted the notion of a catapult. But what's important to note, and I'm not showing you here on this slide, is that actually in this case, catapulting as a strategy is not likely to be successful, because what will happen is that you'll drop this and the ball will actually overshoot the container, bounce back and miss. And instead, these people who are untrained, that is, they hadn't learned this sort of catapulting abstraction, instead are much more likely to actually just hit the ball directly into the goal, and in this case are more likely to be successful. So this is a case where learning this abstraction of a catapult actually blinded people towards trying to reuse that instead of trying to consider other possibilities for what might be the relevant abstraction in this particular case. The other thing that I wanted to talk about just as it relates to tools is this notion of event dynamics. We had some very nice presentations from the previous 2 presenters about how people represent things in space or with skeletons moving through time. But there's a very rich body of work that's also looking at event representations. And those are things like, how would I describe this set of videos as discrete chunks of time that are all going to represent different kinds of events? And abstractions could be useful here because it'll allow us to compress different kinds of representations, as well as generalizing dynamics across space and time, potentially with relation to physics. I want to just give one quick example of physics. I know I'm short on time. So this is an event learning experiment that was done by Wang and Bayerjean in 2017 with fairly young children here, where they were trying to understand whether or not kids could learn the concept of a physical event abstraction with only a few examples through training. So what they had here was they had children just look at 3 different examples with 2 different shapes of these events that have to do with what variables matter to support. So in this case on the left, what they showed children is that if you put the larger part of the object not supported by the block, then it's going to fall. And if you put the larger part supported by the object, it's going to remain stable. And they call this physically congruent because these events are congruent with the true physics of the world. They then asked children to look at these 2 displays where they changed the object in question. And in this unexpected display, the object, despite having the larger part of its side not being supported, does not fall. And the expected display, it's going to stay, the scene is flipped. And so we expect that children will be okay with this. So indeed, if children learn in this condition, they're surprised in this unexpected display that the block does not fall, and they're not surprised in this expected display that the block remains stable. But what's really interesting is that if you just flip the training of this, such that now what you're teaching children is incongruent with physics, where here, for example, this small on event, what you're teaching children is that when the large part of the object is unsupported, it's not going to fall. And conversely, if the large part of the object is supported, it will fall. Now, if you look at their reactions to this, you actually don't see surprise in either case. So despite the fact that now the expected display should be the one that does not match their training condition, right? You don't see that children are surprised, suggesting they haven't learned an abstraction here related to a support type event. And this suggests that abstractions are guided and very deeply intertwined with existing theories about physics, as Dan Baer just talked about. As just a more general thing, I think that these functional objects, as they relate to both events and tools, are really critical for a lot of how we think about perception and action, abstractions. And we see many different examples of this, like circuit diagrams, or even these espresso machines or artificial lungs. And so, yeah, I'm excited to talk about abstractions as they might relate to tool use and tool creation. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Kelsey. As always, we're opening up the floor for any kind of quick clarifying question. Okay, Mark, do you want to finish us off here?
Yes, sounds good. Can you see my screen? Cool.
Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much, Leo, Marcelo, Judy, and Wai Keen for putting this together. I think this is a really cool topic, and I really like the kind of mixture of virtual and in person. It's cool. Yeah, so I'm kind of going to talk more at a high level. I think hopefully it'll kind of complement some of the stuff that people have already talked about, and kind of talk about, yeah, some of the questions that kind of motivate, some of my research and things I'm interested in. Yeah, so I think, one of the questions that we were asked to think about was like, what characterizes useful abstractions? And I think that question requires answering this kind of other question, which is like, what do we mean by useful? Like, useful for what? And so like, there are a lot of different ways in which we can think about abstractions and how they're used. So, we talked a little bit about kind of like abstractions as being used for reconstruction versus like out of sample generalization, and like compression. But we also use abstractions in more kind of like reasoning tasks like planning and kind of thinking about the world and reasoning about things. When we kind of are reasoning about, say, a causal system, we don't necessarily represent it in full detail all the time. And then maybe, we're just like kind of intrinsically motivated to form abstractions. We just like the idea of kind of organizing things into neat categories and stuff. It's kind of just intrinsic to human intelligence to do that. And so I think, there are these kind of normative computational level questions of like, okay, why do we even form abstractions in the first place? That I think, are worth kind of thinking about, and we can talk about it more. And then this kind of another kind of question that I've been thinking about a lot is like, okay, how do abstractions kind of interact with algorithms for decision making? So, we often think about abstractions as kind of being like summaries of like systems in the world, or like, if you have a representation of like, forest and the trees and so on, but like abstractions are also kind of being used internally with algorithms. And so this is related to this idea that, when we're planning, we have to use certain representations and abstractions. So how are those abstractions kind of fitting in with the algorithms that we use in our heads? The second thing that I'm kind of interested in, particularly in the context of thinking about abstraction and action, is that, most actions are kind of part of a much larger sequence of actions in daily life. We're not just like living in a bandit where we kind of pull an arm over and over again. And so, we can ask, well, how are, people, we don't think about the world at the same level of abstraction all the time. And I like to give this example of like the airport, where, if you're, flying to a conference and you have to get to the airport, you're thinking about the airport very differently when you're like at home packing your bag versus when you're, in the airport about to go through security. And, you're kind of you're not thinking about security necessarily when you're at home, or maybe you are, but you're probably not thinking about, the specific, restaurant that you're going to go to. And so as we are kind of like moving through the world and kind of enacting our plans, we are changing our abstractions of the world, even of the same entities in the world. And so we can ask, okay, well, how are those abstractions kind of coordinated over time? And then also, what kind of triggers like changing one's abstraction? What kind of, is it kind of internally driven? To what extent is it internally driven versus kind of externally triggered by cues in the world? And then there's this kind of like going up levels of abstraction. There's this question of like, okay, well, I have abstractions and you all have abstractions too. And we wouldn't be able to coordinate. We wouldn't be able to be having this meeting or this conversation if we didn't, on some level, have coordinated abstractions. And so, like, shared representations are kind of I think a key question to ask when thinking about abstractions. How do groups of people form abstractions? How are abstractions kind of like cultural objects that accumulate over generations? You see this in for example, like in mathematics, like the history of mathematics is kind of like the history of kind of a community of mathematicians kind of forming new abstractions to think about mathematical objects over time, and teaching other people to teaching each other how to come up with the right abstractions and fit different abstractions from different people together, and arguing about what's the right abstraction. And then kind of in this vein of a kind of like the social dimension of abstraction, when we think about other people's minds, that in many ways is a kind of abstraction. We kind of always, we're not thinking about another person's mind or other people in kind of full detail. We're not thinking about, every neuron, even if we could, that's going on in their head. And so, things like theory of mind are actually an abstract theory, potentially, of, intelligent or intentional agents. And so, these kind of questions, I think, all kind of, fit together. And when we're thinking about, what is the point of abstractions? What do we really ultimately want to explain with different abstractions? So yeah, that's me.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Mark, but also thank you, Kelsey, Dan, Hongjing. Okay, so at this point, we're we're going to move into the general panel discussion. We don't have that much time into the hour. So if you have questions, please start typing them into the chat now, because we're going to use that kind of to motivate our stack. To kick things off, I just want to open up this panel and say, obviously we're kind of pulling off a hat trick here today. We said that we've divided up these different workshops along specific domains, and yet we've gone ahead and put together two domains that I think are often considered very closely paired: perception and action. And of course, we've heard from folks that are specializing both, but also I think are uniquely poised to talk about the differences between these two domains. So maybe we can just go around really quickly in the order that we had the original speakers talk, and say, how do you actually think about the relationship between what constitutes both an abstraction as a representation, but also the factors that motivate all these different things that people talk about, how abstractions are learned, how they're used, how they're represented in the mind, between those that emerge in perception and abstractions that are useful for action. And I'm happy to clarify that as needed. Hongjing, do you want to kick us off?
Okay, sure. I think I think especially the topic is abstraction. So I feel like the abstraction is topic, and really not only just like in perception or action, it's actually carry and all these four domains like memory, and then causality, causal reasoning, and language. And then because this, I think all these like three systems, they also almost work together to give the pressure that you need to form the abstract representation. And then you can move and from this very detailed and then sensory inputs, and the matter for perception, and then would be like the pixel level information or action, and a very detailed the motor planning and so on, and really move into a higher level. And then when you have this like a more compressed and the representation, and then I think that the memory and the reasoning and also language for communication and will kick in. I feel like this almost like this whole system and will give you the pressure and then to form this abstract representation.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess my take is that probably all perceptual abstractions are only there because they're useful in some way for action. But I guess I would make a distinction in saying some abstractions are probably so useful and so important for action that no animal would have ever survived without them. And so the formation of those abstractions is probably like baked into development via evolution. So, the one I talked about like perceiving objects as coherent things, I think that is probably something that can develop without, at least actions with the hands or anything like actually moving objects. But, it only is there. We only have that developmental trajectory because it's so important for like when we actually start acting in the world. So I would say that like any good theory of abstraction has to ultimately say, how does this cash out in terms of like being useful for something? I mean, yeah.
Kelsey.
Yeah, I agree with everything Dan just said, and I think it's really important. And I will provide a complementary perspective as my lights go out, that I think that it's very possible to have abstractions in action that are not directly coupled to perception. So like these examples of, having functional abstractions over objects in terms of what they allow you to do does not affect does not at least fully affect you seeing them in exactly the same kind of way. And so there are abstractions that you can have in action that come from instead how those support planning, but that doesn't mean that you have to see them perceptually as the same. And I think that there are very interesting interactions between perceptual abstractions and action abstractions in both directions. But this is, I think, one potential distinction.
So
Mark.
I'm not sure if I totally remember the original question at this point anymore, but it kind of had to do with perception leading into action. I do want to really echo, I think, Kelsey's point that there are, I kind of think of abstraction at like different stages, happening at like different stages of the perception action loop. In perception, there's like very low level abstractions that you can have of like features, and then in action there are like procedural abstractions, like like typing on a keyboard or something, or involve like a lot of abstract kind of actions. And then cognitively, there are like at like more conceptual level, we form abstractions of causal systems. I think it's important that we like not conflate these different abstractions, these different stages of abstraction, because they have a big effect on behavior where in particular those abstractions are being formed. I think kind of understanding the interaction between those things is going to be really critical, I think, for kind of coming up with a coherent theory of abstraction. Because if we're kind of talking about different kinds of abstractions and not realizing that they're actually very different, we could be in a very confusing situation.
Cool, thank you. Okay, we don't have to do this kind of like round robin. I just thought I would open it up to everybody. So we do have one question from the audience, and also I know Wai Keen, you have your hand raised. Wai Keen, do you want to go first, and then we'll take the question from Nilay?
Yeah, sure. So this question's for anyone who's willing to answer. I guess I'm curious, like in your own research, what kinds of abstractions sort of like present in humans have you found sort of easier or harder to like computationally instantiate in like models or machines? And like what explains like the difficulty there? Like Hongjing mentioned sort of visual relations being sort of like one sort of current failure mode, but I'm curious to hear from others. What else do you think is still currently challenging?
Maybe I can just comment on that a little bit more. I think even for the humans, I do think and then relations and then abstract relations and then does require more working memory and then not in the novel situation. But back to the earlier questions, also depend on what relations we're talking about. So some of the spatial relations where humans are very good within 150 milliseconds, we detect it, and then the inside, outside of the relations and so on. So these types of abstraction, it's a special, it's very useful, and then for doing and to figure out in the functional relationship and between entities and so on, it seems like we have the special mechanisms to support these types of abstraction. But if you're in a novel situation, and the first time you're trying to design a special tool, so you're trying to design and then these artificial lungs, and now you have to creatively and put the relations together. So there, and I do think more cognitive resources and will be involved. And then that's kind of the second part, I think, is that what's this current the machine intelligence is still lacking. And also another thing, my general impression about the deep learning types of model is that they tend to entangle and the relations and the entities, and they are related. And then if you don't separate these two things, and then I think and then getting the abstraction out and it will be challenging.
Great, thank you.
Kelsey.
Yeah, can I add a very quick follow-up to that, since the artificial lung was brought up? Yeah, I think that actually creating abstractions from scratch, like essentially doing something like acknowledging the abstractions of a lung to then create a new object that satisfies those same abstractions, is currently computationally unsolved. And both for cognitive models and also for machine learning models. And it's a massive open problem, in my opinion.
Dan?
Yeah, yes, my experience is maybe even more, I don't know, like I haven't found any of it to be easy at all. I mean, even the case of just trying to figure out like what a physical object is. I think what Kelsey said, like trying to create an abstraction. And, if you think about maybe the like canonical case now of like learning to categorize objects or categorize images, I would say even that we don't really have a good theory of, because, the way that's done computationally is usually via like, ultimately has some kind of supervised learning where, we're telling the model, like, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a different dog. And that is, very powerful tool, but it's not an explanation of like why, a person comes to categorize things that way, if they're seeing far fewer examples. So I would say it's like sort of an open question everywhere.
And Mark.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything folks have said already. I think a heuristic that I'm using is, if you kind of have perception, cognition, action, like studying abstractions on like either end of that tube are like much easier than studying the stuff inside. And so I think it's not a coincidence that, perception is probably where we know the most about things, and followed by action, and then followed by cognition, I would say. Because I think, we can reflect on perception with our cognition, and we can reflect on our actions with cognition, but it's much harder to kind of reflect on cognition with cognition.
I think that's right. And I think that's actually very related to the question that's being asked in the chat right now. So especially because I think several people invoked, both Kelsey and Mark particularly invoked some kind of cultural or social role of abstraction learning. Someone actually wanted to ask about actually how social abstractions might be considered different from not only just like individual tool use, I think this means, but also just generally the kinds of object abstractions, especially like, it doesn't quite feel like a social abstraction maybe is the same computationally as a Spelke object abstraction. One idea that the person in the chat is mentioning is the role neurologically of like specialized systems like mirror neurons that support social abstraction. But in general, they want to know about the difference between social and kind of individual level perceptual and action-based representations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Yeah, I do think that this question of whether they're like specialized systems, or maybe humans have evolved specialized systems for social abstractions, makes a lot of sense. Comparative work shows that like not all animals have theory of mind, and some of our close relatives do, but like only humans kind of have like theory of mind plus like this extra ingredient of like really wanting to share abstractions and representations and motivations with other people. And so I think, it's either built in that we have a capacity for social abstraction, or we're like especially motivated to form them. I think that seems plausible to me.
Okay, I'm actually going to bounce to the second question in the chat and then kind of modify that for a little bit. So the question in the chat is, representations change depending on situation, task, and a person's abilities. Wondering if there are any thoughts on attention or other mechanisms for what affordances might be useful in a given moment or task. I'm going to zoom out from that actually and say, I'm curious about the role that time scale plays in thinking about the computational mechanisms that have been posited today, because actually some of these, and I think Dan really got to this, are unfolding over very different time scales. It feels like, there's just no way that most animals could survive in the world without some of the basic abilities to represent certain kinds of physical objects. And, those representations are innate. Others, especially the kinds of, on the fly tool use things that Kelsey showed, and also that I know that you, Mark, focus on, are unfolding over very different timescales, often with very different computational resources available to the mind of the agent who's calculating and solving those problems. So even though I think many people have posited here today that solving things that are useful for representation is important for what we think about in a theory of abstraction, there are just extremely different timescales. Can you guys comment or maybe speculate on how we should think about time as influencing this kind of theory of abstraction?
Do one brief response and then wrap up so we don't run over time.
Well, maybe, okay, I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think that time, like, I fully agree that basically different timescales require different kinds of abstractions. And I guess just going back to the way I was thinking about it before, it's really not like time scale so much as like, what is the problem situation? Like, what is the task at hand that, you know, you require sort of like a good, efficient abstraction or mental model to solve. And, you know, obviously things like building a house or like replacing a lung are problems that, you know, aren't being solved on the hundreds of milliseconds time scale. And so, you know, they would only be possible to solve with like very different types of abstractions than others. So, you know, I totally buy that you just require very different things. Although I think Kelsey said something that I also fully agree with, which is that it's probably the case that those longer timescale abstractions need to be built up out of, you know, the ones that we kind of start with very early in life.
Great.